Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Christianity. Today I'm joined by Khalil Andani, Joshua Sijuwade, and Steven Nemes, and we are talking about some objections to the Trinity. And so this is a sort, you may call it a 1v2, but basically we've got three different scholars that have written on this issue, and it's just going to be a really good time of just talking about it. Well, I guess in particular one model of the Trinity, the monarchical view of the Trinity, which Joshua Sijuwade is growing more and more famous as a prominent defender of this view. So Josh is going to spell out what this view is, and then we're going to get basically some objections to that view from Khalil, who is a Muslim scholar, and then Steven Nemes, who is a Protestant scholar. And so that's basically what we've got on the docket for this video. What we're going to do is we're actually going to start with a presentation from Josh. It's about a 20-minute presentation, give or take. And then after that, we're going to pass it over to Khalil, who is going to give his presentation of his own. And then we're just going to have some good back and forth on this topic. So that's what you can expect if you watch this entire video. Let's go ahead and now turn it over to Josh for your presentation.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Cameron. So yeah, I'm just going to be introducing to you just the specific interpretation of the Trinity that I affirm and defend, and then I'm going to preempt some objections to it. So the doctrine of the Trinity, in the way that I understand it, consists of two main tenets. The first one is the Trinity consists of three relationally distinct but ontologically equal divine persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And the second tenet is that the one God is numerically identical to one of the entities, the Father, who is the sole ultimate source of the Son and the Spirit. Now, the reason why we hold to these tenets is because they're grounded upon certain revealed knowledge. And this revealed knowledge is contained within the scriptural texts and then also exposited and explained and defined in the conciliar texts. So certain scriptural passages indicate that the one God is the Father. So there's a numerical identity with the one God and the Father. So we see various statements where it says, for example, that the only true God is the Father, where Jesus says also that I'm sending to my Father and to your Father, to my God and your God. He also says for us, there is one God, the Father. And then the other one we have is the God and the Father of Lord Jesus. So we have sort of an identification there quite clearly that the Father is the one God. And so what we see within Scripture is that actually the Father and God seem to be co-referring terms, such that sometimes the term God is used for the Father alone in the sentence, and then sometimes the Father is used, but it's indicating that we're speaking about the one God. So it seems to be quite clear according to Scripture that the one God is the Father. But then we also find various passages which indicate that there are two other divine beings. And one of the key ones that we'll see, and I'm sort of going to unpack this later as well in further verses, we see things where, for example, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and then the Word became flesh. And so we seem to have an identification here of the Word, who then became flesh of the person of Jesus, as God. And then we have verses where the Holy Spirit, in this specific verse, is actually identified, as you see sort of at the end, as God. And so what we see in these verses is that we have on the one hand, the one God as the Father, but then we have the Spirit being called God and the Son also being called God as well, or the Word. And so the way that we sort of make sense of this is saying that there is an equivocation in the word God. When we are using the word God for the Father, we're referring to it in its nominal sense. That means we're using it as a name for the fundamental entity. And then when we are referring to the Son and the Spirit, we're not using it in that same sense. We're using it in a predicative sense, which ascribes to them divinity. It's just describing them as divine persons. And then what we see later on in a very important creed called the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed of 381, it says 391 there, but it's actually 381, is that we have a very clear explanation of this as well. We have the one God being identified as the Father. It says, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty. So the one God is identified as the Father. And then we see the Lord Jesus Christ is called the Son of God. So Son of God, God must then be referring to the Father. And then he says that he's God from God, true God from true God, consubstantial with the Father. So we seem to have here that there is a sharing of some form of nature with the Father. And so what we've understood from this is that this is saying that the Son is homoousios with the Father. That means that he shares the same nature, and so he's divine in the same way that the Father is divine. And then we see later on as well the Holy Spirit, who proceeds from the Father and the Son, if you hold to the filioque, or just the Father if you don't. The idea here is that we see that the Holy Spirit is also understood to be worshipped and glorified alongside the the Father and the Son. And so because of that, we can also understand him to be a divine person. So the best way, as I was saying, to make sense of this is to say that we have this idea that there is one God the Father, and there are two other divine persons, the Son and the Spirit. Now, just in sort of breaking these terms down in the specific statement, it's helpful to understand what these terms are meaning, what we mean by relationally distinct and ontologically equal. Ontologically equal just means each of the persons possess the one divine nature, so they share the nature that the Father has, and that means that they are equally divine in the sense that they are maximally powerful, knowledgeable, good, and so on. Relationally distinct is the idea that the way that we distinguish between the persons is not by their nature in the sense of their divinity. They have the same divinity, but in the sense of their relation to one another. The Father is a divine person who's unbegotten. The Son is the one who's eternally begotten by the Father, and the Spirit is the one who eternally proceeds through from the Father through the Son. So that's the way that we distinguish between them. And then we have the idea that the one God, as I said to you for the second tenet, is the idea that the one God is uniquely identified as the Father. And what I mean by that is that he's the ungrounded ground of both the Son and the Spirit and all other things. And so he's the sole fundamental entity within reality. And so this allows us to use that term in the nominal sense. The nominal sense picks out that being who's the fundamental divine person. And within the Trinity, that's the Father alone. Now, what's also important here is the idea of monotheism, because within all the Abrahamic faiths, so we're talking about Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, and other purported monotheistic faiths, we have the idea that there's a belief in one God. Now, a lot of people will push back on Trinitarianism and say, how is there a belief in one God when you believe in three divine persons? Well, I think the best way to understand this is by actually trying to explicate what we mean by monotheism. Sometimes we actually just use the word monotheism without actually understanding what's the best way of conceiving of it. Now, the way I conceive of it is simply as the belief that there is one God, and the way that I explicate that is that the belief that there's only one fundamental divine entity. So when we say that we are monotheistic, we're not saying that we do not agree that there are other deities, potential deities that exist, or divine persons. What we're saying is that there is only one who's the fundamental divine person or divine entity or deity. And so the idea here is that we understand God to be a being who's divine and a being that is fundamental. So to be divine is just to have the maximal properties such as being all powerful, all knowing, all loving, and then being fundamental, as I said before, is the idea of being the ungrounded ground of everything else. But it's also flexible enough, because in the real definition I have in my written work is that you can also be a part of the set of entities, which is the ground of everything else. So you can have a plurality of fundamental entities and not just one by itself. So anyways, monotheism is the idea that there is only one fundamental divine entity. Now, this is helpful because it's a definition that's fruitful in the way that it can make sense of the way that monotheism is used, firstly, in ancient Jewish belief, because the idea in ancient Jewish belief was not, and if you see a lot of scholars who have worked on this, such as Larry Hurtado, Richard Dawkins, Paula Friedrichsen, and other people, they've really pushed back on this idea that monotheism was the idea in one deity, the belief in one deity or the belief in one divine person. That was not true, because the Jews of that time believed in actually many deities existing. And so this idea here fits with this idea that why Jews were classed as monotheists, even though they believed in multiple deities within their worldview, was because they only believed that one of those deities, Yahweh, was the sole creator, the sole ruler of everything. And so he had ontological priority over everything. And so that sort of fits with this idea of him being fundamental. But it also fits with polytheism, because some people might push back and say, well, if theism is theism is the idea that there is a belief in a being that is divine and fundamental, then how do we make sense of, let's say, the pantheon of gods that we had in Greek pagan worship or other pagan forms of religion? How do we make sense of polytheism? Well, I believe the best way to define polytheism is the idea that there are multiple fundamental divine entities. So instead of there being one, which is monotheism, you're saying there is more than one, there's multiple divine entities. Now, the key thing here, which is quite important, is that when you look at a paradigm example of polytheism, like the Greek pantheon, we had Zeus and Apollo and other individuals, you have this idea that they were created, because I know this is an objection that came up before, that you have these beings that were created and they were caused. So, for example, Zeus came into existence. But the key point is, to be fundamental is to be ungrounded. You can still be caused to exist, but you can still be caused and be ungrounded. And so Zeus and all the other deities were ungrounded entities because there was nothing that was sustaining them in existence at the point of their existence. So as you understand, grounding is a synchronic relation. That means it's a relation that accounts for something existing at a particular time. And so when we say something's ungrounded, we're saying that it doesn't exist, it doesn't have something that's grounding it in existence at that particular time. And so when we have Zeus come into existence, he had a causal explanation for his existence, but he didn't have a ground for his existence as he was going through his, how long, if he existed forever or whatever in the specific myth. But the idea here is that you have ungrounded entities within the Greek pantheon. And one example of this, which is an interesting story, is the binding of Zeus. There was a story that was written where you had Zeus basically trying to be overthrown by the other Olympian gods. They were tired of his mischievous ways and they decided that they were going to kill him. But then someone told him that this was going to happen, and then they unfortunately they weren't able to go through the act, and so that they were punished by Zeus. Now the key point is here: if Zeus was the ground of their existence at every point of their existing, then why would they try and kill Zeus? It doesn't seem to make sense. It doesn't seem to make sense, for example, if oxygen is grounding my existence now, that I'm going to try and get rid of all the oxygen in the room. It just doesn't seem to make sense because then I will cease to exist. And so the idea here is that they were going to plot to get rid of Zeus because Zeus isn't keeping them in existence. And so the key point here is that you had the deities existing as as fundamental entities, and there were multiple fundamental entities in the Greek pantheon, but even though they had a causal explanation for their existence, they came to existence at a particular time, they didn't have a ground for their existence, and so they were able to function as multiple fundamental entities. Anyways, the key point here is that we have God being understood as a divine fundamental being, and monotheism is the belief that there's only one fundamental divine being. And this fits with ancient Jewish monotheism and also can ward off the problem of polytheism. Now, why we should, outside of the way that it fits and preserves monotheism, why we should also hold to the monarchy of the Father, specifically monarchical Trinitarianism, is because it does provide a way to deal with the logical problem of the Trinity. So with the logical problem of Trinity, stated very simply, we have these statements here: the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God, there is only one God. Now, if you just take it as read there, it seems to be contradictory, because on the one hand, we're saying there's only one God, but then we're saying there are three gods. Now, the way to make sense of this is through the equivocation strategy that's provided by monarchical Trinitarianism, where we understand that there is a difference between the nominal sense of the word God and the predicative sense. So when we say that the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God, what we're really meaning is that the Father is God in a predicative sense, the Son is God in a predicative sense, and the Holy Spirit is God in a predicative sense, but there's only one God in the nominal sense, the Father. And another way to understand this, which is more clearer in speech, is that the Father is a divine person, the Son is a divine person, the Holy Spirit is a divine person. There is only one fundamental divine person, the Father, and there is no logical inconsistency in those sets of statements. And this solution is grounded upon, as I showed before, the creeds and the biblical witness. So you have a way to have a grounded Trinitarianism, but doesn't have this problem of logical inconsistency. And so just a summary of what we have here. We have monarchical Trinitarianism providing us with a biblically grounded, creedically orthodox, and philosophically coherent approach to the Trinity. It identifies the Father as the one God in the nominal sense and affirms the full divinity of the Son and the Spirit. It resolves the logical problem of the Trinity, and it provides a robust form of monotheism, while also recognizing that there are more than one divine persons. And this is sort of just an image of the sort of framework that is here. You have the Father being the ground of the Son and the Spirit, and so he's the fundamental entity, fundamental divine person, and then the Son and the Spirit are derivative entities, yet they still are equal in the sense that they possess the same divine nature. So there is no Arianism, there is no subordinationism ontologically, and you don't also have modalism. Now, just moving on to some issues for analysis, which we might be able to pick up in our dialogue. The first one is warding off a problem. The first problem that you can sort of raise here is something called the Aseity objection. So the idea here is, as I've put forward, is that the Father grounds the Son and the Spirit's existence. So this means that only the Father possesses Aseity. Aseity is the property of not depending upon anything else for your existence or nature. So basically, it's self-existence. Now, some people might put forward the problem, such as William Lane Craig and Ryan Mullins, that this seems to create an apparent ontological inequality between the persons. That means that they do not share the same essence, the same nature. And so if you affirm monarchical Trinitarianism, it seems that you're also affirming that there is an ontological hierarchy in the Trinity where the Father has a different nature than the Son because he and the Spirit because he is Aseity. Now, this is the problem. However, I don't believe this is a real problem once we understand what type of property Aseity is. Now, in my previous work, I did utilize a certain definition of Aseity, grounded upon a certain understanding of intrinsicality. Now, in recent work, which is just a paper that's under review, I've sort of rejigged my understanding of Aseity by utilizing a simple theory of intrinsicality. So this was put forward by a philosopher called Whitmer, and it's just another theory of intrinsicality, which is the more intuitive one, and it drops all of this sort of independence of accompaniment and all the stuff that you find in Lewis's work. So basically, an intrinsic property is, just reading here, necessarily for any x, if x has f, then for any property g and any individual y, where y is not identical to x, and x is not ontologically dependent on y, it is not the case that x has f in virtue of y's having g. So basically, just in a simple sense, that if I have a property, it's an intrinsic property only if I do not have that property in virtue of another entity having a property that grounds my possession of it. So if I have a property such as, for example, power or having certain mental capacities, this property of having power, is that dependent upon someone else having a certain property? If it is, then that will be an extrinsic property. Now, a clear sort of paradigm example would be properties such as being a brother, being a father. So being a father of someone, that is an extrinsic property because I only have that property in virtue of my daughters having the property of being generated by myself and my wife. So intrinsic properties are ones that I have in virtue of myself. Extrinsic properties are ones I have in virtue of someone else possessing other properties. Now, what's the way that I utilize that now is that when you understand Aseity is a property that's dependent upon the possession or lack thereof of certain properties. So you're only Aseity if you lack grounding relations to something else. So Aseity is not actually something that you possess in virtue of yourself. You only possess Aseity because no one else is grounding you. So what you have here is that, and I sort of assume a view where there are negative properties, and I've given some reasons here, which we can go through later, where we have good reasons to believe in negative properties. So not having a quality, not standing in a relation. These are properties that we possess. So entities around God, for example, they possess a negative property of not grounding God in existence. And so then God's property of being Aseity, not being grounded, is had in virtue of other beings having the negative properties of not grounding God in existence. So what we have here is that there is actually a dependence relation where God is having this property because the things around him, they are not, they lack the grounding relations to him. Now compare that to omnipotence, for example. God has omnipotence irrespective of any other property that anyone has. So God has omnipotence in and of himself. He doesn't have it because he's not standing in a relation to anyone else, or he's lacking standing in a relation to anyone else. Aseity is only had by God because he doesn't stand in the relation of being grounded by someone else. So if I take another person, Y, that Y has the negative property of not grounding X. And so the reason why X has the property of Aseity is because of Y possessing that negative property. So there are two ways to view this. You can either view it as the possession of a negative property of not grounding X, or you can take it as just not standing in a relation to X. So you can take it in a relational way or in a property way. But the key point here is Aseity is outward looking. It's only possessed because the lack of something else, by the lack of possession of something by something else. With omnipotence and other properties, that's not the case. Okay. Now I want to move on. So moving on from the philosophical stuff, we're now going to move on to the divinity of the persons. This is going to be a big area of sort of discussion between us. In the monarchical Trinitarianism, there is an affirmation that there are three divine persons. The Son and the Spirit are as divine as the Father. Now the question would be, why should we believe this given revelation, given scripture? Now there are I would say, quite clear passages where divinity is ascribed to the Son and the Spirit. And I'm going to break this down, not through scriptural exegesis of these passages, but I'm going to go through further developments that have been made in ancient Jewish thinking and study, which shows that the Son seems to have divinity, and then we can also ascribe this to the Spirit. But just to start off, we're going to look at some clear verses that seem to ascribe divinity to the Son. So we have here the first one, which we've looked at already. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and lived among us. So it seems to the Word was ascribed with being God there. The second one is, have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. The third one is, and not according to Christ, for in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily. We have another verse where it says, Thomas answered him, my Lord and my God. Another verse where it says, to those who have obtained a faith of equal standing with ours by the righteousness of our God and Saviour Jesus Christ. Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. And replied, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days. But the temple he had spoken of was his body. And the last one is, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. So the other ones are quite clear because they're just ascribing the term God to Christ, or saying that he has the fullness of deity. But the last two is this idea of the temple. So the idea that Christ...
Josh, that is, not to cut you off, but that is 20 minutes. Would you like to
really?
continue? Yeah.
Could I just, is it fine, guys, if I can just continue, maybe finish this bit off and then we can go on to other slides later? So just with the last sort of point here about the temple, we seem to have here that Jesus is saying that he's going to replace the temple with himself. And he's even saying that he's greater than the temple. But if you understand how the temple functioned within ancient Judaism and Second Temple Judaism, it was the idea that God's presence was in the temple. And so anything that was going to replace the temple had to indicate that they had God's presence within them. And so there's an indication here that Jesus is saying that actually the presence of God is dwelling within me. And then we also have other stuff for the Holy Spirit. We can maybe go into this when we go into our discussion. Yeah, I can stop there for you if you want, and then we can pick this up. We've got a lot of time to talk about things. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. Let's now turn it over to Khalil and Steven. So whenever you guys are ready, I can still set a timer, but I feel like we're just gonna, have a good time. So I'll still set a timer regardless, and then once we get close, I'll let you guys know. But then we'll try to get into the discussion period as quickly as possible. So just let me know whenever you begin. I'll start the timer.
Okay, I'll just share my screen, and this is just a summary of some of our points.
Josh, go ahead and unshare yours really quickly.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, so let me begin by thanking Dr. Joshua for coming here 2 days in a row to defend his theology. It's almost like you're getting an inquisition, 21st century style. So thank you, Cameron, for hosting this. I'm sort of the odd man out because I'm the only one here who doesn't identify as a Christian in the last 2 days. But I'm honored to be part of this. So thank you, Cameron, for setting this up. And I'm really glad that Dr. Steven Nemes, my friend, is also along. So as people know, a couple of weeks ago, Cameron and Joshua did a very interesting video on objections to the Trinity. And then myself and Dr. Nemes, we responded to it. And in the spirit of collegiality, we thought, why don't we all just get together here and chat about it? So what I have here is a list of summary objections that either myself or Steven will present. So these have basically been divided. So some are for Steven, some are for me. So we don't really want to go 2 versus 1, even though by the looks of things, Joshua could probably bench press both of us with one arm each. So we can just go in order. So one of us can present the objection, and I'm guessing then Joshua and that person could sort of back and forth about it. And Cameron, I guess the onus will be on you, Cameron, to allocate fixed amount of time per thing. So we sort of move through. So the first objection that we raised last week, which we'll raise again, is we do not believe that Jesus in the New Testament or even I would say the historical Jesus. But if you want to just say Jesus as presented in the New Testament, we don't believe that he claimed to be God or he claimed to be divine by his own essence. And I'll let Steven sort of speak to that one.
Sure, thank you. On the point of whether Joshua could bench press both of us, Joshua certainly is strong, but I don't want you to underestimate how fat I am. So I might even, there might be a limit to how much even Joshua can do. I certainly agree that the question of Jesus' relation to God is the most important one in the New Testament. I certainly agree that there are very many passages in the New Testament which seem to present Jesus in relation to God about as closely as a human being or a human person could be. I think the principal point of contention between Joshua and me will be whether the ascriptions of divinity, let's say, made to Jesus in the New Testament are done in one mode or rather than another. So let's distinguish between, in my books, I talk about something's being predicated of an object originally or derivatively. So for example, the sun is luminous originally because that's just the sort of thing that the sun is. It produces light on its own. The moon, when it's a full moon, is also luminous. It reflects light. It lightens things. But it's not originally luminous. It's only derivatively luminous because it gains this power of illuminating things from the sun. So the sun is originally luminous. The moon is derivatively luminous. So also, human beings possess the power to communicate in an original sense because that's just the sort of things that they are. A normal, properly developed human being can communicate. Books also possess the power of communication, but derivatively, because they are made use of in a certain way by human beings. So the power of communication belongs to books and to signs and billboards and the rest in a derivative manner. You can communicate something with a book because a human being is giving a book that power and that capability. But human beings only possess the power of communication in this original sense. So what I'm going to say in response to Joshua's argument is that the way that Jesus is described as divine in the New Testament is only ever as derivative, not as original. Jesus is not originally divine. He is not divine by nature. If he is divine at all, he is divine by grace, or he is divine because of God's special action upon him. So he's divine in a derivative sense. Now, of course, because the way that the New Testament describes Jesus is varied from one book to another, and because there are a lot of different ways in which divinity or divine power or divine wisdom and the rest are attributed to Jesus differs from book to book, it's not as if I can give a single reading strategy that is going to apply unambiguously to every single text. But this is the first point that I would make, that Jesus, if he is presented as divine in the Bible at all, it is because he is derivatively divine. Now, how is he derivatively divine? In what sense? From my point of view, it seems to me that you can make sense of everything that's in the New Testament if you accept the following picture. Jesus is by nature a human being. At his baptism by John, he is filled with God's Spirit and is empowered and authorized by God in a special way. He does all the miracles and he exercises his authority in a unique way because of God's special anointing and power. He dies, he is resurrected from the dead, and then he ascends into heaven. And that's the way in which Jesus is described as divine in the New Testament. Now, I think also there are passages which describe Jesus as God or as a God, which properly speaking refer to Christ after his resurrection, when he is in a different state of being than before. So before his resurrection, he is an ordinary human being like the rest of us who happens to have the Holy Spirit, in a special measure. But after his resurrection, he assumes a new condition, which would properly be called deified. He undergoes what in Orthodox theology, for example, is called theosis, where he is divinized, he is deified, he is given a new condition of the sort that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15 and in other places. And so we have to determine, okay, when it's a matter of Jesus exercising apparent divinity during his lifetime, this is a matter of his derivative divinity. It's because God is especially operative and active in him. But when Jesus is described as a God or as divine, for example, in the epistles of Paul or in Pauline literature, more broadly speaking, it is because he has a new condition now in virtue of his resurrection, which makes him divine in a more special sense. So I think that if you accept this picture, everything that the New Testament says can be interpreted just fine. This is not to say that you could not in principle interpret the New Testament in the other way. Okay, one thing that I've learned over the years that I've been studying theology, and it's been a long time for me, is that in principle you can make the text say whatever you want. What you can take the words on the page and you can propose a context for them, and then you can make those words say whatever you want if you just give them a context. And a lot of times theological debates really amount to giving, competing contexts for the words that are on the page. And you at the end of the day, you just sort of decide, well, I think this is more likely the context, or I think that is more likely. So I am not going to say that the Orthodox sort of Nicene Trinitarian interpretation of the New Testament is impossible. I do think, however, that it is an interpretation of the text, within a context that is unlikely from my point of view. And I'll give one example.
Steven, I was just going to say,
ahead.
I mean, you've been going for about 5.5 minutes, and I'm trying to make sure that we get to as many topics as possible. Do you mind if we let Josh come in at this point and
yeah, sure. So Josh, you can say something. What I was going to propose is that we'd talk concretely about certain texts. So I've given sort of a theoretical introduction until now. Maybe it would be helpful if we talk concretely about certain texts. But also, Josh, if you have a different point, you can bring it up now, I suppose.
Yeah, I was going to take it in a certain way. Is it fine just to share one slide if possible, Cameron?
Yes.
Wait, let me just get this back up. Yeah, so I've got it up here.
So Khalil probably will have to unshare his.
No, I think I can make it work. One sec. There we go. Okay, well, yeah, this should be a little bit better. Okay, 1 second. There we go.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for that, Stephen. And I do understand, as you're saying, that there are multiple interpretations of the text. You were saying about likelihood. So even though the sort of Nicene interpretation of the text, where we're ascribing divinity to the Son, that is a possible interpretation, but it's not a likely one. I'll push back on that and say, within the context of the time of when these texts were written, how was monotheism and divinity understood at that time? Now, drawing from the work of Richard Borkham and Larry Hurtado, we can sort of understand that within the time period of when the earliest texts were written, so we're talking about from the 1st century into the middle part of the 2nd century, there was sort of a certain way that people understood Judaic monotheism. Judaic monotheism was sort of categorized by two ways. The first way was the worship practice or the devotional practice of the Jews. Even though that they allowed other deities within their worldview, there was only one God who we worship. And worship was a way that they were able to sort of draw that distinction between that which is God and that which is not God. And then another way, drawing from sort of Borkham's work, that was Hurtado's the first one. Drawing from Borkham's work, another way is understanding the actual identity of God. God was the being who was the sole creator and sole ruler of everything. So if we take into context that the way that the Jews were able to understand their monotheism, that God is the only being whom we worship, and he's the only being who's the sole ruler and sole creator, we then seem to have a weird scenario that happens with the Christians, because the Christians then sort of do something where they have a dyadic devotional pattern to Jesus. So I know you were saying you made this distinction between divine by grace and divine by nature. Now, the key point here is that worship, firstly, was only given to God because he is divine, supremely divine by nature. And so what we then have is that Jesus is then worshipped alongside the Father, not in replacement of him, but alongside the Father in an unprecedented way. And so we have things like prayers being offered to him, invocation of his name, baptism in his name, the Lord's Supper, hymns and psalms being sung to him. These were a devotional pattern, which was only given to God alone. And this is the way that they expressed their monotheistic worship. And then what we have with the idea of the creatorship and rulership of God, we also have Christ participating in this according to the New Testament. Christ has a role within creation. As Paul said, for in him all things were created, all things have been created through him. The one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. We then have Christ being the one who is the ruler alongside the Father. He has sovereignty over the world. He is the head. He's exalted above the angels. He shares God's throne, the divine names given to him. So the reason I'm bringing these things up is because if you make this distinction between being divine by grace and divine by nature, what precedent do we have for that type of practice within Judaism? Because we do have other people who were divine by grace. So, for example, you have people like Moses, who, as it says in Exodus 7:1, he was like God to Pharaoh. God made him like him to Pharaoh. We have the judges of Israel who were empowered by God's Spirit to do certain actions, but they were not inherently divine. We have angelic beings as well who were described as gods in Psalm 82. So we have this divine by grace working in the Old Testament. But the weird thing is that there is never exclusive worship which is given to these beings. We never have the Jews worshipping Yahweh and worshipping the angelic beings, or worshipping Yahweh and worshipping Moses and the other prophets. We never have Moses and the other prophets having any centralized role within the worship practice of the Jews. But we do have Christ being that happening to Christ. As I said to you, he became the focus of prayers, baptism, hymns. Also other rites were given to him. And then also, you never have any other person who's ascribed having a role in creation. God is there's never intermediary between God and creation with Moses or with any other people who are divine by grace. But we have Christ having that intermediary role where he, as I said to you, he had a role within creation. He has sovereign authority and divine authority, and the conferral of the divine name is given to him and to no one else, again, who is divine by grace. So if we're speaking about the likelihood of your interpretation, we have to take into account the whole Old Testament and say, okay, if Jesus was divine by grace and he was exalted to a supreme position, then should we find the same way that he was central in the worship practice and in the unique identity of God, should we also find that with people who were exalted in the Judaic worldview as well? We don't find that. And so I would say then that the likelihood actually shifts to him being able to be given worship in this way and him being able to be a partaker in the creative work and the rulership of God because he's divine by nature. That's the reason why. And so that's why the Jews, sorry, just last one here. This is why the Jews never had any pushback about monotheism in the text. We never see people calling Paul a polytheist and things like that, is because they were ascribing worship and the authority to Jesus alongside the Father, but it's the idea of him being divine by nature, not divine by grace.
Yeah, let's bring Steven back in now.
So I thank you very much for the presentation. I think actually there's a few examples that undermine your case, and I'll mention what they are. One of the titles that Jesus most commonly uses for himself in the New Testament is Son of Man. And he speaks about it as though it were something like a title or an official title, just like Messiah or Son of God and so on. Now, there are controversies about exactly, what does Jesus mean when he says Son of Man? Is he talking about himself? Is he talking about something else? There are complications here, but I will, for my own purposes, I'll take the view that seems reasonable to me. I think when Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, or when Jesus refers to the Son of Man, he's referring to himself. And I think that he is getting this figure or this notion of the Son of Man from Daniel and from First Enoch. In Daniel chapter 7, we have Daniel has a dream, the prophet does. And in his dream, he sees these four monsters who arise out of the sea, and then they fall and they die. And then after that, he sees a figure like a human being, a figure like a son of a man, coming with the clouds and being brought before the throne of the Ancient of Days. And the Ancient of Days rewards this person who looks like a human being with kingdom, dominion, and power, and all the nations will serve him, etc. And then when the Daniel asks the angel about the interpretation of this dream, the angel explains to him that there are these four kingdoms that are going to arise. The last fourth king is going to be particularly terrible. He's going to die. The ancient one is going to come in and enact the judgment in favor of the holy ones of the Most High, the people of Israel, and then they are going to receive the kingdom. So it seems to me that in Daniel, there is the prophecy of an eschatological, or however you want to call it, apocalyptic intervention by God after a particularly turbulent period of the arriving of 4 different kings. God is going to intervene. He's going to destroy those people, and then he's going to give the kingdom over to the holy ones of the people of Israel, to the holy ones of the Most High, which are Israel, particularly righteous persons among Israel. And then they are going to have the kingdom, and then they are going to be served by the nations, and so on. So there's really here going on a situation of reversal, because the first chapters of Daniel involve the story of the people in Babylon, I think it is, and Nebuchadnezzar tries to enact a law that they all have to worship and serve him, but some of the Hebrews refuse and they get thrown into the oven, but they don't die. And then Daniel refuses, but he is thrown into the. So this question about service comes up. King Nebuchadnezzar claims this service for himself. He demands that people serve him. He is not granted that. And then what happens is that after these 4 kingdoms arise, then the service is going to be granted to the people of Israel, who are the holy ones of the Most High. So really there's a sort of a reversal here. Whereas the king Nebuchadnezzar tried to get the service for himself, Israel is going to be granted the service of the nations as a gift by God. It's a special dispensation. Now in Daniel, it seems to me that the Son of Man represents the people of Israel. The giving of the kingdom to the Son of Man by the Most High, or by the Ancient of Days, is the dreamlike representation of an intervention on God's part, which is to the disfavor of these kingdoms and to the favor of the people of Israel. In literature like First Enoch, you get the Son of Man being presented as a singular individual who is very highly special. God keeps him as a secret. He's going to appear on the final days. He's going to judge the nations. He's going to punish the wicked, and he's going to reward the righteous. Now, what's interesting is that in First Enoch, you would get the impression that the Son of Man is some sort of strange figure who is mysterious in his identity. Nobody knows who he is. And then at the end of the passage, it turns out that Enoch is taken up into heaven, and he is told that he is the Son of Man. Now, what is interesting about this is that just like at the end of a movie with a twist ending, the twist ending sort of recolors everything that came before. So although Enoch seems to talk about the Son of Man figure as though he's always existed and he's been hidden from all of time and so on and so forth, the fact that Enoch himself, who is a human being, is identified with this Son of Man figure changes things. And so what Enoch sees as though it were taking place in the distant past, in fact, is happening in his future, because Enoch has not come back yet. So in this apocalyptic literature, you have human beings being granted all these things, service, power, dominion, etc., by God, as a result of God's climactic intervention in history. With First Enoch, you even have the notion that a human being is going to be assigned to be the judge of the nations, because that's what Son of Man means, is human being. And when Christ calls himself the Son of Man, I think that Jesus took himself to be this person. He thought that he was the human being whom God had assigned to enact God's kingdom on earth, to judge the wicked, to create a place for the righteous. And so it's not a surprise to me if he receives the worship. Now, for example, there are biblical passages in 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 20. The people are gathered. David says to the people, "Bless the Lord your God." And then the text says that the people, bowing the knee, worshipped the Lord and the king. And so we have there the single verb worship. In the Septuagint, it's the verb proskuneo, which means to bow or to show obeisance. And it has 2 direct objects, namely first the Lord and then the king. So in the case of this Old Testament passage, you do have the king being worshipped or shown obeisance or veneration by the people alongside the Lord. Now, that doesn't mean that the king is divine, at least not by nature, but it does mean that the king is incorporated into this act of reverence towards the God, because he is God's king that he's assigned. So also in Psalm chapter 2, the king is told that he is God's son, and then the nations are told that they should beware of this guy because God will give him the nations as his inheritance if he wants. And then it's a part of the deference I should put it this way: the deference that the nations show to the king, the newly installed king, is a part of their responding appropriately to the Lord. Right? So the Lord sort of takes this king and makes him a part of his identity. Just like, for example, when I married my wife, and now she's a part of who I am, and I am forever the husband of Rachel, and she's the wife of Stephen. So also, God, when he chooses a human being to this special purpose, sort of binds his identity to him, and he becomes the God of this person, and this person becomes God's special chosen person. So I think that there are precedents in Second Temple Judaism and in the Old Testament for human beings to be highly exalted. I mean, at the end of the day, this is what Genesis 1 says. Genesis 1 says that the human being was made in the image and likeness of God. Interpreters say that this means that the human being is something like God's vicegerent on the face of the earth. He's the representative of God, and it's his responsibility to take care of the earth on behalf of God. So to me, it's not surprising at all to say that a human being was involved. It receives worship or veneration, we could say. A human being is involved in the judgment. A human being enacts all these, acts of authority. With respect to the creation, I will also make this one point. Here, I know I'm not going to convince you, but I will just make the point because I think it's relevant. It seems to me that the earliest Christians had the notion of Christ as a creator in the sense of the inaugurator of the new creation. What they thought Christ was doing by healing people, by forgiving the sick, by empowering people, by lifting them up out of the slime, so to speak, was recreating the world and bringing about a new creation. He was not creating ex nihilo. Just like, for example, when the psalmist says, "Create in me a new heart," he is not saying, "Create in me ex nihilo a new heart," but rather change the heart that I already have. Make it so that it's new. It has a new form of being. So the way that I would read those statements with respect to Christ creating things is as applying to Christ in virtue of his being the agent of the new creation. He recreates people, he forgives sins, he teaches people, he restores, he heals the sick, and so on. And this is a sort of a new creation, and he is the agent of that new creation, not of the original creation that Genesis talks about. I know I'm not going to convince you about that, and strictly speaking, I don't know. That was not one of the topics that you had brought up in the original video. So I don't know if I'm as equally prepared to talk about this as I am about the other things. Although you can push me back on anything you want. But that's what I would say. With respect to Christ creating the world, really, I think in the New Testament, he's conceived of as the creator of a new creation or of a new humanity. For example, in Ephesians, Paul says that he makes a new humanity out of the two, Gentiles and Jews. So that's what I would say.
Okay. Is it fine to respond, Cameron, or do you want to?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, you raised a lot of issues. Hopefully, I can address most of them. So I don't believe that the examples you gave were counterexamples, because what I was saying to you is that I wasn't arguing for there not being an elevation of people in the Old Testament. I was actually affirming that there was a high elevation of individuals who were even divine by grace. Moses and other people, and Enoch, as you were saying, they were elevated to a very, very high level. And I'm not debating that at all. I'm not even debating that there was some form of worship. And again, worship is a very ambiguous word. As you were saying, it's sort of a reverence for an individual. I don't debate that either. What I was saying is that Jesus was not just elevated to another level. He wasn't just revered, but he became the central aspect of the devotional pattern of his followers, which was unprecedented. The king was not at the center of the worship practice of the kingdom that he was ruling. Moses was not of the people that he was leading. Enoch was not eschatologically for the people that he would be overseeing. But what we see at the point of Jesus' resurrection is that we see the text expressing the idea that Jesus now, alongside God, is now at the central aspect of the worship devotional pattern of the followers of him. And as Hurtado says, he calls this a mutation to the monotheistic practice of the Jews, because it was unheard of. As a mutation is a new sort of generation of something that comes about. We have that happening with the devotional pattern, where Jesus now becomes a central aspect of the worship. They worship God through Jesus, and even worship is given. Prayers and other things are given actually to Jesus himself. So what we have here, I would say, is unprecedented in the Old Testament. Yes, we might have elevated figures. Yes, we might have revered individuals. Yes, we might have people who they're prostrated to, but we don't have the centralized form of worship and devotion that's given to Jesus in the Old Testament. Now, so my idea here is why then should we, what grounds do we have within our background knowledge to say then that this mutation happened because of elevation? Because if it was just solely because Jesus was elevated to the highest level, then we should have what was happening to elevated figures in the Old Testament. But what we have is a new thing now, where he's the central aspect of worship alongside that of the Father. So what I'm saying to you here is the only explanation I believe that is likely in this scenario is because he's divine like the Father. And then, sorry, just before you might respond, to just so I don't forget your other points, you then brought up the idea of ruling and of being the creator. Again, I have no problem in saying that there would be maybe eschatology. Let's say we go with your Son of Man interpretation, which again can be pushed against, and people say that there are other interpretations. But if we go with your interpretation, yes, there might be an eschatological rulership that's given to someone. But again, what we're having here is that the rulership of God is now identified with that of Christ, which again is unprecedented. We have the rulership actually happening, that God rules ultimately over the world through the figure of Christ. And then with the creatorship, I really don't, as you were saying, I don't buy that interpretation. Because if you see the way Paul was speaking about it, saying that from God all things have been created, and through Christ all things are created. So then he's talking obviously about the creative action of God. Why would we then equivocate and say when Paul is talking about the creative work of the Son, he's talking about the new creation. When he's talking about the creative work of the Father, he's talking about the general creation. No, it seems to be that he's saying creation stems from the creative act, stems from God, and is through Christ, because he did use the term all things. So it's not just the one segment of the new creation, but it seems to be all of creation. So again, what I'm saying here is if we take all the data on board, God is a sole creator and sole ruler within ancient Jewish monotheism, and he's the sole person who's worthy of worship. Christ is then given the act of being creator alongside God and ruler, and also is given the same worship as the Father. Then for me, the best explanation of that data is because he shares the divine nature. That's why he's worthy, unlike every other individual who was not, even though elevated, were not part of the creative act, the ultimate rulership, or had the devotional centralized worship that Christ had. I think that interpretation is the most expantorily powerful.
Let's do this, because we do need to move on to other topics. Otherwise, we could basically spend the rest of the time on this one. Let's get one more response from Steven, then one more response from Josh, and then let's move on to another objection.
So I will say very briefly, Joshua, I think the argument that you're presenting is logically invalid. So it may be that Christ in the New Testament is presented as occupying a special role in religion that is unprecedented. Okay. You are proposing that the best explanation for this privileged role that Christ occupies in the New Testament religion is the fact that he's divine by nature. That doesn't follow, because it's equally possible that God can have granted him this role. And what I was suggesting earlier is that there are significant precedents actually for this sort of thing. So, for example, in 1 Enoch, the Son of Man is worshipped. He is said to be seated by God on God's own throne, and he judges the nations, and the nations worship him. So it seems to me that there you have a really significant portion of the precedent of what I'm talking about. For the Son of Man in 1 Enoch is put by God on God's own throne. He judges all the nations, and the nation worship him. But he's still a human being. He's still called Son of Man. And I don't personally think that there is anything in 1 Enoch to justify the ascription of something beyond humanity by nature anyway to the Son of Man. The second point that I'll make is that for Paul, even Christ is subordinated to God, and even Christ one day will hand over the kingdom back to God. That's what he says in 1 Corinthians 15. Now, historically, Gregory of Nyssa tries to get out of this by saying that the Son there refers to humanity as a whole, and not to the one person of Jesus of Nazareth. So there's, he tries to get out of this and say that the whole of humanity is going to be brought over to God. But the Son, the person of the Son, the divine person, is not going to lose the kingdom because, of course, he's consubstantial with the Father. I don't think that that's a reasonable interpretation. I think what Paul is saying is quite clearly that Christ is going to reign for a while. And then once his reign reaches its telos, its goal, then he's going to hand the kingdom back over to God. And then that'll be the end of it. Then God alone will be king. So that's what Paul seems to say. The third point that I want to make is that this is, I think, an eminently Jewish point. This is the whole secret of Jewish religion, as far as I'm concerned, that God gives the responsibility of caring for the world and of ruling over it to human beings. That's what he gives to Adam and Eve in the garden. He tells them to multiply and to take dominion and to rule over the earth. This is what you get in the apocalyptic literature, where the final ruler of the world is called the human being, in Daniel and in um, uh, First Enoch. In fact, in Daniel, this is interesting. Towards the middle of the passage of chapter 7, it says that the Ancient One will come, he will intervene, he will enact the judgment for the holy ones of the holy ones of the Most High, and then they will receive the kingdom. Now, the word for kingdom there has what's called the pronominal suffix. It's a little suffix that attaches to the word to make it mean his. So it's not just that they will receive the kingdom, they receive his kingdom. Now, it seems to me clear in context that the one who is receiving his kingdom is the people of the Most High, Israel. But whose kingdom is it? It's God's, because the Son of Man is presented before the Ancient of Days. He gives him a kingdom. Well, he can't give him a kingdom if he doesn't already have one. So this is the whole idea, that human beings are intended by God to rule in his place and for his kingdom to belong to them. You get this in Rabbinic Judaism, in the Bava Metzia, where the story about the excommunication of Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. He has a position. None of the people can refute him. He even works miracles in defense of his position, but they decide against him and they excommunicate him. And one of the arguments that the rabbis give for excommunicating him is that God has given the control of these things to us. So even he can't work miracles to prove his point. It belongs to us, the rabbis, to do this. And then there's the story about God saying afterwards that my children have, overcome me or whatever. So I think you have this idea in Judaism all the time, that God takes the back seat and he gives it to human beings to take care of things. And Jesus, if you read him through this lens, is just the human being who accomplished this. He did actually, take the wheel, so to speak, and he took control of things, and God raised him from the dead and he's exalted him. And now God has decided to do everything through this guy. I think that's the picture that you get in the New Testament. So I don't think that we need to appeal to divine nature or to anything like that, because I think the picture in the New Testament is that Jesus is the one who accomplishes human destiny of taking over the world.
Okay. Something I would firstly say is that it wasn't a deductive argument, so there shouldn't be anything problem about validity. It's an inference of the best explanation of saying what is the best explanation of the set of data that we have. And so it wouldn't have any sort of validity constraints there. It's just saying what actually explains the data the most. And I think your interpretation doesn't, because as I've just understood in your response, yes, you can explain that the rulership of the world, of creation, has been given to God's image bearers, and I completely affirm all of that. But you've only explained a pocket of the data. You haven't explained, in I would say a plausible manner, why he's part of the creative action of God. Because as I was saying to you, there's an emphasis on him being the creative, or God creates through him, all things through him. And so again, there's an emphasis on all things, not just a section of the creation, which is new creation, but all of creation is through him. Then you have the rulership, which you were able partly to explain, I would say. But then you didn't explain at all about the centralized form of worship. Again, I would easily say, yes, people are worshipped throughout the Old Testament. I have no problem with that. Again, we have, a weird sort of an open question about what we actually mean by worship. Was it just reverence? Was it just prostration? But what I'm trying to say to you is that there's an unprecedented centralized form of worship, where Christ becomes the central aspect of worship within the religion, which was unheard of. You see, the very famous phrase that I'm the Lord God, you shall worship none other but me. And so it's quite clear that the way that the Jews identify themselves, and you see this within the Roman era, why were the Jews called atheists? They were atheists because they weren't worshiping the pagan gods. It wasn't because they weren't believing in other deities. It's because they weren't participating in the sacrificial acts and rites with the other gods. They weren't doing that, because for them, that was the crossing the red line of saying, actually, we're stepping out of our monotheism here. But then when we have the Christians coming along, they have Christ being the central aspect of worship. And so what I'm saying to you here is the explanatory power seems to be that if you say he's divine by nature, the only reason why God is worshipped above all other things is because in Judaism, he's a supreme aspect of creation. He creates all things, and he's the supremely divine one. That's why we worship God. But then Christ is worshipped. So then what can we draw from that? Well, he must only be worshipped, not because God has elevated him, because that worship was only given to God alone as a recognition of his status as being the sole supreme divine entity that created all things. It's because, I would say to you, he shares a divine nature with the Father. So if you remember, within monarchical Trinitarianism, the Son doesn't have the divine nature in and of himself. He has it because of the Father. So it's communicated to him eternally. And so he's able to do the things because the Father has given him his nature eternally. And so this fits perfectly with the idea why he's then able to have a dyadic form of worship given to him, where he's a central aspect of worship. He's also included within the creative action of God. And then he's also taken to be the universal ruler of all creation. And I have no problem with that verse where it says he'll give the kingdom back to God. Because again, within monarchical Trinitarianism, there is a relational hierarchy, not ontological, but relational, where the Father is the fundamental entity. And so all things will be given back to him. And that doesn't mean that Christ is not divine by nature.
So let's at this point, let's switch to another objection. And I want to bring Khalil in. He hasn't had really a chance to speak much yet, but I would love to bring him in. He is a philosopher of religion in the analytic tradition. So, well, I guess the same thing is true of Steven and Joshua as well. They're both philosophers of religion. But let's bring Khalil in. What do you think about switching gears and talking about, just so you can have some interaction with Josh, discussing the Aseity objection and whether or not the property is intrinsic or extrinsic?
Yeah, we can do that. Josh, you need a break? You just went.
No, I'm good. I'm good.
You just went toe to toe with Steven. Now you get to do another one. Sure. Let's talk about that. So, I noticed that you sort of changed your appeal on this point. So, if you recall, maybe not 1 year ago, you appealed to these Langdon and Lewis, right? To say that Aseity is not an intrinsic property. So now you're appealing to someone else. So, I mean, in the spirit of honesty, I'm just going to say that I get the sense that the way you go about this concept of Aseity is, it seems to me that you're sort of just looking for analytic philosophers, frameworks that will lead you to the conclusion that Aseity is not an intrinsic property, right? Like you pick these guys first, right? And at least I think I've shown that it doesn't really work. So now you've just sort of found another analytic philosopher's framework who will lead you to the desired conclusion. So, I mean, the way it looks to me, you're sort of starting with the conclusion, and then you're like filling out the analytic machinery to get to that conclusion. But even in your new appeal about Aseity, I took a little bit of notes on it. But the overall idea that you're floating on Aseity is, you said, for example, that the things around God or the Father do not ground God. So that's why God is ase, right? God is ase because it just happens to be the case that nothing accompanying God is grounding God. Which, again, what that tells us is God is not ase because of his own essence. God is ase because of other things. That's basically the entailment of what you just presented. So if I put it in a different way, whose fault is it that God is ase? Is it God's fault that he's ase, or is it the fault of some other item that happens to exist? If we say it's God's fault, i.e., if we say God is ase due to himself, then aseity would be an intrinsic property. But if we say that God is ase due to other things, right? Even if it's due to something that other things are not doing, like other things are not causing God, God is ase because of other things, then God's aseity is due to another, even if it's due to the absence of another. And that would make aseity itself a dependent property, which gives you this very paradoxical idea that aseity lacks aseity. And if that's the case, we're going to end up with an infinite regress of aseities, because like there's nowhere is aseity intrinsic, right? Because that would be a question to you: if aseity is not intrinsic to God, is aseity intrinsic to anything? If the answer is always going to be aseity is not intrinsic to anything, whatever is ase has it extrinsically, we get an infinite regress of dependent aseity, And then I don't know how you can still use natural theology to argue for the existence of God the Father as a logically necessary ase reality. So to me, I still see a problem there. And you also, I mean, you said in your explanation today that, look, aseity is really it's really a negative property. But you a few minutes before you said that, you said aseity is self-existent. So self-existence or self-sufficiency is not a negative thing, it's also a positive thing, right? So if we define aseity in a positive sense, then the question is, does the Father have self-existence intrinsically? And if the Father does not have it intrinsically, then something other than the Father, something else, is giving the Father the ability to be ase, in which case the Father is actually not ase. So then who is ase?
Okay. Can I respond here? There's a few things there before I forget some of them. Okay, so the first issue you were saying about finding sort of a paradigm or framework or theory that fits aseity. And so basically presuming the conclusion and then trying to find something that supports it. Well, I wouldn't say that as such. The way that I went about this was first, when I looked at aseity, I thought about it and I said, this property appears to me intuitively to be a bit different from the other properties that we look at, but we never really think about it deeply. But aseity, being uncaused or ungrounded, seems to be a little bit different from being all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving. And so I had this sort of intuitive look and saying, okay, this is a bit strange. And then I had a sort of a deep dive into the literature on intrinsicality, because there is a big debate about what does it actually mean for a property to be intrinsic. But again, with philosophy of religion, sometimes it takes time for the work in metaphysics to sort of get funneled down into philosophy of religion. And so then when I first sort of took my first stab at trying to show that aseity, in the intuitive sort of sense that I had it, was different, and so was extrinsic, I went with the sort of general working paradigm that a lot of people have used, which was Langton and Lewis's work. Because David Lewis is so influential, a lot of the stuff that he's done in metaphysics, it just goes to the top of the reading list for a lot of people. And so a lot of people were saying this is the main sort of definition of intrinsicality. And so I used that, and then I thought about it and said, actually, it doesn't seem that intrinsicality seems to fulfill one of the criteria for being an intrinsic property, and so it must be extrinsic. But then after thinking through this, hearing objections from yourselves and others, when I've sort of delivered papers on this, I did think through this and say, okay, maybe I don't have to take the baggage of Lewis's definition, because he puts in a lot of metaphysical ideas here, stuff like independence of accompaniment and stuff like that. So I said, okay, let me go back into the literature and see if there is a different theory that does the same as Lewis's and is accepted in the same sort of sense as Lewis's, but it also aids my quest. And so what I was able to find was a simple theory of intrinsicality, where Whitmer, basically a very good paper, he just shows that he goes through all the definitions and basically says all these definitions can be reduced just in a simple theory, where an intrinsic property is one that you have in virtue of yourself and nothing else. And for me, that just seems like a very clear, acceptable understanding of intrinsicality. And that's the only reason I adopted it, because it just seems to be the simplest one. And I was trying to see, does that actually fit with the idea of aseity? And then when I thought through this, I realized that aseity doesn't seem to fulfill that condition, because aseity is only had because of the lack of something outside of that being. But if you look at all the other properties, let's say omniscience. Omniscience is or knowledge for a normal person, or omniscience for God, is possessed by that being in virtue of itself. It has it not because of anything outside of itself. But if, let's say, a being who is ase was in a world where there was a being who grounds everything else, then you would have the issue of that being not being ase. So the whole point here is that aseity seems to have some dependence upon things outside of itself and not just solely in virtue of itself. So according to that definition, it doesn't actually fit with that definition of intrinsicality. And so then what I then was trying to argue wasn't that Aseity is a negative property. That was a misunderstanding. I was saying that Aseity is a positive property, but it's dependent upon negative properties of other things. So it's dependent upon not grounding X. So X has Aseity, not being independent or not dependent upon anything, and it has that in virtue of something else having a negative property. So that's the only reason that it possesses that property. And to understand, basically, Aseity doesn't mean that the property itself has to be Ase. It's the being is Ase. So the being is Ase in the sense that its existence doesn't depend upon anything else. But that property might depend upon other things. So I'll give you an example. God has the property of being the creator of all reality. That is dependent upon what? It's dependent upon there being a creation outside of him. And so that property itself is dependent upon other things. And so that property itself, being the creator of all reality, would be an extrinsic property because it's dependent upon other things. It's not had in virtue of himself. Even though God creates because of his omnipotence, he has that property because there is actually a creation there. And then just the last thing you were saying about the infinite regress. Firstly, you'll have to think a lot of properties. Let's say we go with that creation property, being the creator of all reality, the creator and sustainer of all reality. That property itself will be dependent upon other creation, other beings, and so you'll seem to have a regress of that property itself. But you have to remember there are different types of regress in philosophy. There is a vicious infinite regress, and then a benign infinite regress. Property dependence is normally taken to be a benign infinite regress. Even if it is an infinite regress, it's not a problematic one. A vicious infinite regress are things like something's existence having dependence, and then that dependent upon something else, and that depending upon something else. You seem to need to have a source of that existence. But things like property possession, a lot of the time you're going to have an infinite regress taking place, but it's a benign one, it's not a vicious one. So if I assume what you're saying is correct, that there is an infinite regress, you're going to have that for other properties that God has, that he possesses because of other beings. And if he does have it, it's just going to be a benign one and not a vicious one.
Okay, so with regards to Aseity being intrinsic or not, before we get to the regress part. So again, is there any entity in reality that has Aseity as an intrinsic property?
I would say no, because it's categorized as an extrinsic property.
Okay, so why does God, capital G God, why does God have Aseity?
He has Aseity because he is an uncaused being, but the reason why he has Aseity is because him not standing in a grounding relation with other things.
Why is God not grounded by anything else? What's the explanation for that? The extrinsic. Yeah, I'm going to rephrase the question.
Yeah.
What is the extrinsic explanation that God, the Father, is not grounded by anything else?
Well, God just doesn't stand in those grounding relations. I think it would be there wouldn't be an explanatory. Yeah, because God is a if we're talking the capital G God and not the other divine persons.
Yeah.
God is a fundamental being, so he cannot stand in those stand in the grounding relations to other things.
So are you saying that? Okay.
God's existence is brute. God's existence is brute. There is no explanation for why he exists.
So there's no further explanation for the existence of capital G God.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what is the explanation for the aseity of capital G God?
He doesn't stand in any other relation. Those other things don't have to exist. It's just him lacking a relation to other things of grounding. So just by him being
is it possible? Is it logically possible for the fundamental God to be grounded by something else?
No, because if it's part of the essence of God. Sorry, can I just address something quickly before we go this line, because I forgot it, and it is quite important. I believe that you are mistaking intrinsic properties for essential properties. essential properties are things that God must have in order to be what he is. An intrinsic property is just something you have in virtue of yourself. So God has his extrinsic properties like Aseity, essentially, but it's an essential extrinsic property. So you can have essential extrinsic properties, you can have essential intrinsic properties. So that's not a problem. So the reason why God doesn't... Yes,
sorry, please, I didn't mean to interrupt. You were
no, it's fine. So what I'm saying is that you were saying before that it's not an essential, it doesn't seem to be an essential property of God, but that's not correct. You can have essential extrinsic properties, essential relational properties, and you can have essential intrinsic properties. So things like omnipotence and omniscience and perfect goodness are essential intrinsic properties, and Aseity is an essential extrinsic property.
Okay, so what grounds an essential property? The essence, right?
Sorry?
An essential property exists in a being because of its essence. Is that correct? That's why we call it essential?
Yes.
So aseity as an essential property of capital G God exists due to God's essence, correct?
Yes, but that hasn't shown anything because...
Okay, so
you go.
aseity is a property of God because of God's essence.
Okay, but that still hasn't shown anything. Yeah. So, but that doesn't mean that he has it. Yeah.
Is God's essence by definition cannot be grounded by something else, right?
Yes, that's true.
So God's aseity cannot be due to anything other than God's essence. Is that not the case?
Yeah. So I'll give you an example. So a very important thesis within metaphysics is origin essentialism. The idea that we basically have our parents essentially, and so my property of being the son of my father is an essential property that I have, but that's an extrinsic property. So even though I have the extrinsic property of being the son of my dad, I have it in virtue of standing in a relation of generation to my dad, it's essential to me. I have it and it makes me what I am. So what you have to understand is that's the same thing with the extrinsic property of Aseity. God has it in the sense that it makes it what he is, because in the essence is expressed by a real definition. So for example, I'm a neo-Aristotelian. So I understand an essence in a different way from other philosophers that might take in a more modal sense. So an essence is just something which you have, which expresses what you are. Okay, so if I was to write down the definition of what you are,
that's fine. So I get that. My essence,
Let's let Josh finish this thought here real quick.
Yeah, so part of the real definition of me, part of my essence is being the son of my dad. Even though that's extrinsic, it is something I have that's essential to me. Now, the same thing with God. God has the Aseity property being uncaused or ungrounded. That's something which makes him what he is, okay, is part of his essence. But again, it's an extrinsic property because he possesses it because his lack of standing in a grounding relation to other things. And it can be other possible things as well. So because he lacks that grounding relation to other things, there is no grounding relation between him and any other possible thing that could exist. He then is Ase, but he has that essentially. So that's why you need to understand that you can have extrinsic properties that are essential, but it doesn't make it non-essential because it's extrinsic.
Okay, so in the example you use where my essence is essential to me, right? But it's extrinsic. That's because my parents in this case cause me. So in a sense, my parents are constitutive of my essence. We can't apply that to God, right? There is nothing that's causing God to exist. So I feel like that analogy just doesn't apply. And then when you repeated your formula again, you said, look, God has aseity because God is not grounded by anything else. Okay, that's true as a descriptive thing. God is ase, because nothing grounds God. The deeper question is, Why is it the case that nothing grounds God? Is it because nothing out there like chose to generate God, or is it because of the very nature or essence of God that God just cannot be grounded? And I'm saying it's the second one. Even if for this argument's sake, Aseity was defined as extrinsic to God, there has to be something intrinsic to God to explain why God is Aseity, to explain why God isn't grounded by anything.
Why
If you
must it be intrinsic to God?
Sorry, why I didn't you cut out?
Why must it be intrinsic? Why must there be something intrinsic to God to ground that extrinsic property?
Okay, so an extrinsic property, when it's possessed by a particular entity, right? There has to, if it's extrinsic to it, right? Extrinsic means it comes from outside of it.
Oh, no. It doesn't mean it comes from outside. It doesn't mean there was a point that it. No, it just means that it's an outward looking
It's
property.
due to, no, if
Yeah,
something is extrinsic,
yeah,
it's extrinsic due to something external to the entity. That's why you're
yes,
labeling it extrinsic.
yeah,
So
yes.
then I'm asking for an explanation. There's an explanation of why me being the son of Mr. and Mrs. Andani, there's an explanation why that is essential and extrinsic to me. The explanation is Mr. and Mrs. Andani. For God, we can't make an appeal to something of outside of God to explain why God has aseity. We can only appeal to God's own nature to explain why he has aseity. And if you do appeal to something outside of God and you say, look, all these other entities, they just happened not to generate this God. If you do appeal, then God exists and God is ase due to another, which would make God a contingent being in and of himself. So either you have a
No,
contingent
yeah,
God or you have a God who is intrinsically ase. I don't really see the third option here.
yeah. But I think there's a mistake here. So there's dependence relations in property possession, and there's dependence relation relative to the existence of an entity. So what I was trying to say to you is that you can possess a property that's dependent upon something else, but you still exist irrespective of that other thing. So what I was saying to you, like for example, the property of being the creator and sustainer of all reality, that's a property that's dependent upon other things existing. So it's extrinsic, but God exists as the creator of all reality in virtue of himself. He has it because he's omnipotent. He creates everything that he wants. But the property that he possesses, he has it dependent upon other things. I'll give you another example. If you assume Trinitarianism, for example, you'll have God having the property of being loved by the Son. Now, that is an essential property because there is no time when the Father is not loved by the Son. There is no possible world where the Father is not loved by the Son. That will be an essential property of him, but it will also be an extrinsic property of him. It'll be a property that he has, and he is dependent upon the Son loving him, but it can never be the case that he doesn't love him. So it's the same thing. God has this necessarily, but it's something that he could only have in virtue of something else. So what you have, all the property of not being hated by the Son. That's a property that God possesses, and he possesses it essentially because there can never be any possible world where he's hated by the Son. But it's an extrinsic property. So what I'm trying to say to you, so it's basically that's a similar property to Aseity, not being hated by the Son, because it's just saying he doesn't stand in a relation of hate to the Son. He doesn't stand in that property. It's extrinsic, but it's also essential to him because there is no world in which God exists where he's hated by the Son. There's no possible world. And so it's the same thing with Aseity. Aseity is a property that God has by him not standing in a relation to anything that grounds him. And it can never be the case that there's anything that grounds him. So it's essential to him, but it's still extrinsic. So what I really believe is sort of flaming the fires of your objection is this problem between essential properties and extrinsic and intrinsic, and there's a distinction there, and also the problem between dependence of properties and depending for your existence upon something. You can depend upon properties for something, but also not depend upon your existence, such as, again, depending on the property being loved by the Son, the Father's property of being loved by the Son is dependent upon the Son loving him. But his existence is not dependent upon the Son. So the same thing with Aseity. Aseity is a property of not being grounded by anything. That property is dependent upon other things not grounding him. But his existence is not dependent upon anything. So essential properties can be had, but they can be had in an extrinsic fashion in a way that doesn't seem to have a problem with essential properties or essential possession.
Before I respond, Cameron, how are we on time? Do you want to referee on this a little?
I am enjoying this entirely too much, so that's why I haven't really been keeping track. We are at about the 25-minute mark in this section, so I think we're okay to go. We went about 30 minutes for the last one. Let's go maybe another 5 minutes here, and then we'll move to another objection. We may only get to 3 total today. And maybe if we could, if the next one, if we can pick one where both of you guys could interact, that might be a way to sort of round out the show. Sure. And I know, Steven, I think on this one as well, like you could, I think there was one of the objections is that you were able to interact with this one as well, that you think that it's still intrinsic no matter what you do. So
sure.
If you want, we could continue.
I'll give a short remark and then Steven can hop in on the same point. I think we're saying something similar. So Joshua, just to the example of the Father being loved by the Son or hated by the Son. Okay. I understand what your counterexample. My issue with this.
Before someone sort of clips this video and says I said that he's hated by the Son. It's not hated by the Son.
Yeah, let's say loved by the Son, right? So the Father is loved by the Son, right?
Yeah.
So I would say this: the property of being loved by the Son and the existence of the Father. Okay. The property being loved by the Son is a property that is super added to the existence of the Father. And it's a property that could be decoupled from the existence of the Father. Okay? Just logically speaking. So you have the Father's existence plus the property of being loved by the Son, being hated by somebody else, by Satan, or whatever it is. So here, the existence and the property is super added to the existence. This, in my humble opinion, is not adequate to talk about the relationship between aseity and the existence of the Father, because aseity is not a property that is super added to the existence of the Father. Rather, aseity is a description of the mode of the existence of the Father. The Father's existence is an existence which is entirely ungrounded. That's why we call it ase. Ase meaning not from something else. Whereas the existence of the Son, the existence of the Spirit, those are grounded. So aseity is not just something you can super add to the Father's existence. Aseity rather is a description of the mode of existence of the Father. So therefore, what I'm saying is, if we want to say that the Father's aseity is dependent or extrinsic meaning it would be a property that's dependent on something else. If we want to say that about his aseity, it would follow then that since the aseity of the Father describes his existence, then the Father's existence would undoubtedly end up being dependent on whatever it is you make the Father's aseity dependent on. So that's just my response to your example there. You can respond to me, and then I'm going to let Steven come in with his point on this.
Yeah, those are, honestly, Khalil, if I'm honest, you've given the best pushback on these points from other people. So thank you very much. I would say I disagree with you again, as you'll assume. The first reason why I disagree with you is because, just going with the example that I gave, I do believe it's apt. The reason why is because it isn't something that can be decoupled from the existence of the Father. How you know that is because there is no logically possible world where there is a case where the Son doesn't love the Father. So every logically possible world will be one in which the Father is loved by the Son. So you will never find a world where, logically speaking, you can decouple it. So I would say that's apt. But either way, Again, I think you also need to realize that fundamentality, so similar to Aseity, same thing, being ungrounded, is a super added property, because the existence of the Father is had by him because of his omnipotence. He's omnipotent, and that's, so for me, similar to Swinburne, I believe that all the divine properties flow from omnipotence in a way. And so omnipotence, the reason why God exists is because he's omnipotent. And so there's no way that he could not exist, given his omnipotence. And that's same with the Son and the Spirit. But then the way that God exists is by an underived form of omnipotence. So that underivedness, that fundamentality, that independence is a super added property. You have his omnipotence, which grounds his existence. And then you have, well, how does he exist? Well, he exists fundamentally. Okay, and that is a super added property. It's an additional property to his omnipotence. And so the only way your argument works is if you already assume your position that you have to put Aseity within the essence, within the intrinsic properties of God. Because what I'm saying to you, omnipotence and all the other properties are the things that make God exist. And then you have Aseity, which is an extrinsic property that doesn't make God exist as such, it just individuates him. We can pick out this divine person because he is the uncaused one. And the way we pick out the Son and the Spirit is because they are the derived ones. And so they're just individuating properties, but they're not the things which actually make God what he is as such, in the sense of his intrinsic great-making properties, his omnipotence, his omniscience, and things like that. So I do believe it is super added, and super added in because it functions as an individuating factor of God. So I feel that your position only works if you already assume that it is something which is already part of the intrinsic properties of God. Yeah.
Okay, so let's now turn to Steven.
Yeah, I could say more, but we want to have a nice discussion. So Steven, why don't you have anything to add on just the Aseity? Then I would also say, since Steven is here, our next objection is related to this. It sort of follows from it, which is called the Trinity to Infinity objection. So I'll let Steven speak to this, and then I'll also let him take us into that.
Yeah.
So for me, the principal issue with this question of Aseity is as follows. Let's say that I grant that Aseity is an extrinsic property. God the Father is Ase because nothing else causes him to exist. Okay, that's fine. Still, there is the question of whether or not there might be some intrinsic property of God's that can complicate things here a bit. Because it seems to me that if there are extrinsic properties at all, extrinsic properties ultimately have to be grounded by the intrinsic properties, either of that thing that has the extrinsic property or of something else's. So, for example, Khalil has the extrinsic property of being seen by me. But that's because he just happens to have that property, but it's because I happen to have the intrinsic property of seeing, something that is Khalil. So I'm undergoing a certain visual process, and in virtue of my undergoing that certain visual process, which is intrinsic to me, Khalil has an extrinsic property. So if a thing has an extrinsic property, it's because something else, either that thing or something else, has an intrinsic property. Now I'm going to say that the reason why nothing else causes God the Father to exist is because God the Father has a certain intrinsic property, which we might call self-existence. Now, if this property, if God does have this property of self-existence, which is the reason why he exists and is the reason why nothing else causes him to exist and nothing else can cause him to exist, then the question is, does he have this property of self-existence essentially or not? If the property of self-existence is a part of God's essence, then the Son and the Spirit do not share in God's essence because they don't have self-existence. If the property of self-existence is not a part of God's essence, then he's composite because he has his essence, and then he has this additional property of self-existence. So I want to try to put you in a bind here. I'm sorry, I don't mean harm by it, but I want to catch you in a trap. I think that if you're going to say that God is Ase, even if you grant that Aseity is an extrinsic property, ultimately extrinsic properties are explained in virtue of intrinsic properties. So there must be some intrinsic property somewhere which explains why God is Ase. It can't be in anything else because before God creates anything, there is nothing else. And God is Ase before he creates anything. So it must be in God. Now this property, I say, which makes God to be Ase, will be, I'll call it self-existence. And then the question is, does God have self-existence essentially or not? If he has it essentially, then the Father and the Son do not have the same essence because the Son does not have self-existence. If he does not have it essentially, if the Father does not have self-existence essentially, then the Father is composite. He has an essence, and then he has this additional property of being self-existent. So this is the way that I would put the dilemma. I'm interested to know how you would respond to it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, very good point. Very good objection. The first thing I would say is I don't believe that the extrinsic properties are grounded upon intrinsic properties. I really think that's an incorrect assumption. Just given the definition of an intrinsic property, the very simple one that I was working with, that an intrinsic property is one that you have in virtue of yourself and nothing else. So the converse of that is I have an extrinsic property if I have it in virtue of something else. So the reason why I have a property extrinsically is because of something else having a property or me standing in relation to something else. Now, let's say we go with your example. So Khalil has the extrinsic property of being seen by Steven, and you have the property of seeing Khalil. Well, that property that you said was intrinsic, seeing Khalil, is not an intrinsic property. That's extrinsic, because you only have the property of seeing Khalil because Khalil exists and he's there. That's the reason that you have that property. Or seeing the computer screen in front of me, I only have that because that's in front of me. So the properties that you were saying, they're both actually extrinsic. The extrinsic property that Khalil has of being seen by Steven is had because of Steven seeing him. But then the property that Steven has of seeing Khalil is only had because Khalil is there to be seen. So it's not had in virtue of yourself, it's had in virtue of another.
Can I respond to this point briefly?
Yeah.
I agree with you. Depending on how the property is phrased, my property of seeing Khalil can make it sound like, at the very least, it can make it sound like it's a relational property. But it is still true that if there were nothing true about me intrinsically, Khalil could not have the property of being seen by me. Because at the very least, you can name, I am undergoing some sort of visual process. All right. So I am undergoing a visual experience of some sort. And then you can add to that property various other things which make it to be the case that I'm seeing Khalil. And then from the fact that I'm seeing Khalil, you can say that Khalil is seen by me. So still, even if it's not immediate, you can trace a line back from the extrinsic property that Khalil has to an intrinsic property that I have. So it doesn't have to be direct. It can be by various mediating factors. But what I'm going to say is that you cannot have an extrinsic property without an intrinsic property somewhere.
Okay. I have no problem with that, but I don't believe that presents a problem, because I think with the definition, it would have to be that an extrinsic property is had if, in part, you have it because of something else. So if in that chain you have that property in virtue of something else, then that makes it extrinsic. So if we were to look at, for example, my power or my ability to lift something, that seems to be intrinsic. It's intrinsic to me. I have that ability in and of myself and not in virtue of something else. But you seeing Khalil, even though, as you were saying, there is a sort of the grounding chain might terminate in something that's intrinsic, your ability to see. In that chain, you will have a dependence upon something outside of yourself. And so that will make that property that you have extrinsic. But let's say we grant all of these sort of issues and we go with what you were saying about self-existence. I believe that self-existence is a reducible property. Because that's why, for example, in the presentation, we sort of can I flowed between self-existent and being uncaused. I believe that being self-existent is just sort of reducible to being uncaused. Why is God self-existent? Because there's nothing else that causes him. And so he exists in virtue of whatever, in a brute way. But I would also, it also depends upon the way that you see God existing. I take God to have a brute form of existence. So there isn't any explanation for why he exists. Other people might say that God does have an explanation. His explanation for his existence is his nature. So he's self-existent in that fashion. So again, it sort of depends upon if you believe that God has an explanation for him actually existing. Does it terminate in anything? I would say that the answer to why does God exist? Well, he's uncaused. He's ungrounded. That's why he exists. He's just ungrounded, and that's where it stops. And I won't go to a further property of self-existence. But let's say we grant that as well, and we go with that further property of self-existence. We go to the dilemma you sort of raised of does it, if it's part of the essence of the Father, then it means that the Son and the Spirit cannot have that as his essence. I would disagree with you, because within essence, there are two forms of essence. There is a particular essence or individual essence, and there is a general essence. or kind essence. So the kind essence is a thing that you have in virtue of being part of a kind. So, for example, I am part of the kind human, and so are both of you, and so we all share in that essence of being human. We have the general essence of being human. But then we also have our own particular essence, which allows us to be individuated within that kind. And my individual essence will be Joshness, Khalilness, and you have, and then Stevenness, that whatever it is that makes you what you are as a particular entity, that will be your individual or particular essence. Now, when it comes to self-existence, someone could easily just say self-existence is part of the particular essence of the Father. So he is a self-existent one that allows us to individuate him, but it's nothing that makes him part of his general essence. So you'll have to put an argument again to why you need to put his general essence. And this is why it's important with sort of the distinction that I brought here between intrinsic and extrinsic, because other people have argued in this way. So for example, like Bo as well, Bo Branson, he argues that being uncaused or being self-existent is part of the individual essence of the Father. And it's not part of the general essence. So similar to what I was saying. But then the further question is, why is it part of the individual essence and not part of the general essence? You then have to go with my argument of the things that are part of the individual essence of God are his extrinsic properties. The things that are part of his general essence are his intrinsic properties that he shares with the other things within that kind. And so for me, you still haven't really dealt with the problem of saying that because it's an essential property of God, that he cannot share the same essence of the Son and the Spirit, because it's just simply within his particular essence and not in the general essence which he shares with the Son and the Spirit.
So I will say this. If you say that God does not have a property of self-existence and his existence is brute, then the problem is that you just make it a matter of luck that God exists. He exists. Nothing else is here. Nothing caused me to exist. I'm just here. Okay, great. Well, why don't I produce a son and a spirit, and then let's go and have some fun. So if you say that God's existence is a matter of just a brute fact, then you make it lucky that God exists. If you instead try to propose that God exists as a matter of essence, so that it's not a matter of luck, there's a rational explanation or an ontological grounding for God's existence, then you distinguish between his personal essence and his common essence. Now, my problem is that you are still making the Father composite. You're making God composite and not simple, because you have the personal essence and then you have the common essence. Now, you will say that the personal essence are strictly extrinsic properties that God bears. Okay, it cannot be strictly that, because again, there has to be an intrinsic property, which is the grounding of every extrinsic property. So let's talk about the logical moment before God generates the Son. Okay, so in the logical moment before the generation of the Son, before there is a Son, there is just the ultimate principle. He exists. He doesn't have any extrinsic properties because there's nothing else to exist, but he still has to have a personal essence. So there must be something in his personal essence, namely his self-existence. If you put the self-existence in his common essence, then the Son doesn't share the common essence anymore. If you put the self-existence in the personal essence, then again, you've made God composite, because now he has a common essence, which is intrinsic, and then self-existence, which is also intrinsic, but personal to him. So it seems to me you cannot, there's always a further step back to take beyond extrinsic properties. You cannot leave the personal essence of the Father merely at the level of extrinsic properties, because prior to the generation of the Son, there is no more Father anymore. He has to be something before he generates the Son, and that means that he has to have self-existence. And if it's a part of his personal essence, then he's composite. If it's a part of the common essence, then the Son does not share that common essence with the Father.
Okay, yeah, great points. The first one about we can call it the luck objection. So it's sort of me just being a Swinburnian. I sort of follow Swinburne's role, Swinburne's position. Now, interestingly, Swinburne has actually changed his position. In the latest edition of the Coherence of Theism, he believes that God exists because he causes himself to exist in an analogical fashion. But let's just go with old Swinburne. Old Swinburne was sort of the position that God exists brutally. Now, I agree with Swinburne on that, but the reason why I agree is slightly different, is because if God has an explanation for his existence, then he cannot be fundamental, because fundamentality is tied to metaphysical explanation. So when you have a fundamental being, you have no metaphysical explanation for its existence. When you have a non-fundamental being, you have a metaphysical explanation for its existence. So the problem that you have is you cannot utilize fundamentality then in trying to understand who God is. And I think most people want to argue that God is the fundamental entity. There is nothing that's fundamental, more fundamental than God. God is absolutely fundamental. But if you actually understand fundamentality as it's defined in the literature, you lack a metaphysical explanation for your existence. So you just have a brute form of existence. Now, I don't really have a problem with that. And sort of in my work, I've got a book, not trying to plug my book, but I've got a book on the ontological argument where I actually argue for God having presence in every possible world, but he doesn't have to be necessary. So God can still be logically contingent in the sense that I'm saying, but he still is present in every possible world. I won't go into all of that stuff. So anyways, the whole point here is, even if God's existence is contingent in that fashion, and it's brute, I have reasons for it because I want to class him as a fundamental entity. And then secondly, there are ways to go about it that even if God exists in, let's say, one possible world, he still is present in all the possible worlds. But I'll leave that to people to buy the book when it comes out to find the reasons. Okay, then just going with logical moments. I have a problem with logical moments, specifically when it comes to the Trinity, because I don't believe there is any logical moment when the Son doesn't exist. I actually believe that logical moments don't seem to make sense. I know what you're saying with, for example, in a deductive argument, you have logical steps. But when it comes to the Son, there is no logical moment where the Son is not generated, because it's a necessitating act of the Father. If the Father exists, the Son is always there. So there is no logical sort of prior moment to the Son being generated. That will only work if there's a temporal moment. So I think a good way to think about this is like with Molinism, for example, where you have sort of these logical moments that God has: natural knowledge, middle knowledge, and free knowledge. But that only works because there's a sequential temporal sequence where God actually has this knowledge, he then has the middle knowledge, and then he acts, and then there's a free knowledge that he possesses. But when it comes to the Father and the Son, it's always necessarily the case that the Son is there. It's an active essence that the Son exists. And so there can never be a logical moment where the Son doesn't exist. So I think that sort of counterexample just doesn't seem to work at all. I can't just picture a time when the Son wasn't there, because then the Father wouldn't be there, because it's an essential act to the Father to bring about the Son.
So I agree that this talk of logical moments is tricky, but I don't think that the argument that you gave succeeds in finding an escape route. It may be true that as long as the Father exists, the Son exists. That's true. But that's not the same thing as saying that there isn't an order between Father and Son, because two things can be chronologically simultaneous. Two things can always exist together, while at the same time not being one more fundamental than the other. They can just be coeval. Once you do have this notion of fundamentality, then you can say this is before this, right? The Father being prior to the Son means that the Father is before the Son. Even if they always exist together, there is a certain relation of priority one to the other. And then you have to think, okay, well, if there is going to be a relation of priority one to the other, then that which is prior has to be complete. It has to have complete existence logically before that which is posterior comes about. And then it seems that's all that you require for my argument to go through. Because if the Father has complete existence prior to the generation of the Son, and he must in order to generate the Son, because otherwise you would have the Son generated from something incomplete. If the Father does have complete existence logically prior to the generation of the Son, then he has to have a common essence and a particular essence, if we grant that. And then you have to make a choice about where the self-existence of the Son or where the self-existence of the Father is going to lie, in one or the other place. And then you still have the same dilemma. Now, you are going to say that there is no self-existence property, right? The existence of the Father is just a brute fact. You said that if the Father is to be fundamental, then his existence can't be explained in terms of anything else. Well, the way that you get out of this traditionally is by identifying existence and essence in God. And then you say that God's essence just is to exist. There is no separate act of existence which is added to his essence, which brings about his existence. He just exists. He is just existence. And if you do that, then you can no longer say that the Son is brought to existence by the Father, but at the same time, has the same essence as the Father. Because if he had the same essence as the Father, he would just be identical to the Father, like you were arguing yesterday against the Thomist. And I thought that you did very well on this score. So here, I think, is where the problems lie. If you want to grant the property of self-existence, I don't think you can escape this issue of where do you put it, in the common or in the personal essence. If you don't want to admit a property of self-existence, then you have this issue of why does God exist at all? Well, it's just a matter of luck that he exists. And I don't think this response about fundamentality can do the trick, because you can find something that is fundamental if it's self-explaining. Not just that nothing else explains it, but that it explains itself, or that it has sort of, the power of explanation is identical to its own explanation. And that's what, classically speaking, the doctrine of divine simplicity is supposed to do. But if you go in the direction of divine simplicity, then I think you're going to have other problems about Trinity and incarnation, from other directions. So here's how I would sort of situate the discussion.
I was going to say I've tried to stay out of the conversation as much as possible, but I just wanted to invite a little bit of clarity on that last point that you made, Steven. What do you mean by luck?
I mean that, here's what I mean by luck. Something is real. It's a good thing that it's real. It's very favorable, but it wasn't a result of what I did that it happened to me. That's what it means for something to be lucky. I mean, something is true about me, or is true, some favorable state of affairs exists, but it doesn't owe to me at all. It wasn't a result of my effort or my problems, or my effort or my practices or anything like that. Mm-hmm. Now, in the case of God's existing by luck, it's even stronger than that, because it's not just that, I find a $20 bill on the ground and that makes me lucky. God exists, and nothing causes him to exist. And there's no explanation for his existence, not even in himself. That's the ultimate luck. When you exist totally without explanation, that's like being as lucky as possible. And look at how great his existence is too, because he's omnipotent, he's omniscient, it's not just that he exists, but that he has all these wonderful, fantastic, great-making properties too. So he's the luckiest person in the universe, really, because nothing explains his existence. He exists as a matter of brute fact, and also his existence just happens to be the greatest kind there is. So this would make God sort of the luckiest person of any sort of being.
So is your view then that it's impossible for God's existence to be lucky?
Yeah, I don't believe in brute facts. It seems to me that the way that you escape this problem is to make God's essence and existence identical.
Basically, if I can pipe in on this, if I understand what Joshua was saying, where he says God's existence is brute, that means that is to concede that God is contingent, not necessary in himself, but God is a modally and essentially contingent being. And a contingent being is something, when considered in itself, it may exist or it may not exist. Its existence and its non-existence, all considered by itself, they're equally possible. That's what a contingent being is. So usually when a contingent being does exist, there's an explanation for its existence outside of itself. Okay? On the other hand, when you have a being that is necessary in itself, that means by virtue of its own essence, it must exist, and it always exists. So that's contingent and necessary. If you say God is necessary, that would mean that God must exist, and everything about God is also necessary because it's rooted in what God is. But if we say that God's existence is brute, it would mean that God is contingent in himself, and this contingent being, God, happens to exist, but there is no necessitation either outside of God or intrinsic to God to explain why God exists. So God turns out to be a brutally contingent or a brute fact. Now, I think that as soon as anybody believes in this, and it's not just a Josh problem, all you people who believe that God has libertarian free will, you all fall into this. As soon as you accept one type of brute contingency, that is a contingency that actualizes but is not necessitated either by itself or by something else, as soon as you accept that, you might as well give the whole game away to the atheists, because the atheist can point to anything and say, yeah, this is a brute fact. The universe is a brute fact. Creation is a brute fact. And I think it's game over. So I would never want to make that move. And I think it's actually very, very problematic to make.
Can I respond?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I was just wanting to clarify and just mainly for myself to see what Steven was getting at there.
I don't actually see the problem that you're saying here, because what you're trying to assume is that God is logically necessary. But there are different forms of necessity, as you would know. All I'm saying is that it's not important to predicate God's logical necessity to him. He can be logically contingent. That's not a problem. But given the properties that he has, it's not such that there's a way that he might not have existed. Given that, for example, he's past eternal and he's futurely eternal, there is no way that he could not exist. Like, he's always going to exist. Given his omnipotence, again, there is nothing that could stop him from existing. So this idea that God might have existed or might not have existed is actually not true. Given the properties that he has, you can just say that there is no way. There's nothing that could stop God from existing, and he's eternal. There's never been a time when he didn't exist, and there'll never be a time when he stops existing. So you don't have to go and have this really weird property of logical necessity, which a lot of people haven't actually been able to make sense of. What does it actually mean for God to be logically necessary? And things like that, and trying to show that it actually is the case. So for me, I'm saying for your natural theology, you don't need to assume that. And as I was saying to you, in the argument that I'm putting forward in that forthcoming book, even if God is logically contingent, he can be present in every possible world. So that's not a problem at all. And also my natural theology that I've given in my previous work as well is an argument for there being a fundamental being. So an atheist, if they say, well, the existence of the universe is brute, fair enough, but we still need to go and do the inferential work to say, is the simplest explanation of the data? And does it explain the data of the most explanatory power? I would say there being a single, simple, fundamental being that we call God is a better explanation than the brute universe or whatever. So it doesn't stop you from doing natural theology. So for me, all the properties that God has, you don't seem to have that lucky objection. Oh my gosh, it could have been that someone actually killed me, but I'm lucky to be alive. I'm lucky to have won the lottery and had all these things. No, God has all these things, but he doesn't have an explanation for why he exists, because it's impossible to put forward one given his fundamentality. Now, you did say that you bring together essence of existence, but please, I do ask you, make sense of that. Make sense of what it is for something to have as their essence existence. Because I think outside of the Thomistic circle, the majority of people would say that it just doesn't seem to make sense, that someone's essence and existence can be identified in that way that Thomas and others have done. So for me, I would personally say, again, you're having to stomach something which is even more conceptually difficult than just saying God is a fundamental being and there is no explanation for his existence. So for me, I don't see that there are problems that you're actually raising that actually stop natural theology from operating, and it seemed to be a happy circumstance that God exists. No, he's eternal and he's omnipotent, so there's no time when he could have not existed, and there's no time that he will not exist, and there's nothing that could take him out of existence. So it doesn't seem to be any. Who cares if there is a possible world that we can imagine where there is no God? So what? The majority of you are not even modal realists anyway, so you don't believe in all these other possible worlds. They're just hypothetical exercises. So there's only one actual world, and God exists in this actual world, and there's no being that could take him out of existence. He's always eternal. So it's no problem.
So let's get maybe a couple more responses.
Oh,
sorry, Khalil. I just want to sort of wrap things up. We're nearing the 2-hour mark. So let's go ahead and just sort of wrap up some thoughts here on this one objection, and then we'll turn to some just closing thoughts.
Sure. So Joshua, you seem to be you seem to want to have your God and eat him too. So
oh goodness.
On one hand, you say that God is not logically necessary. And then you say that, oh, well, nobody really knows how to explain that. Well, I mean, pardon me, but as a Muslim in the Muslim philosophical tradition, we're the ones who came up with this whole idea of God being the necessary existence in itself. Like, this comes from Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and the Thomists got it from us, as well as other traditions. Even arguably Leibniz got his ideas of this from Islamic philosophy, and we have figured it out, and we've been doing this for 1,000 years. And the problem is that modern analytic philosophers just are ignorant of Islamic philosophy and all of its contributions. So we've never had a problem with this. There's been no serious objection even raised within Islamic civilization towards this idea of God being the necessary existence in himself, or God being logically necessary. And our modal framework is a bit different than the analytic modal framework. So what you guys call necessary and contingent differs with what we call necessary and contingent. Now, on that point, you said God is brute. you don't have to say God is necessary, logically necessary. But then what I heard you do is you appealed to essential properties of God to explain to me why it is impossible for God not to exist. I just heard you do that. When you make that appeal to what God is to account for the impossibility of God's non existence, you are simultaneously making the case for the logical necessity of God's existence. That's what you're doing. Now, on the point about natural theology, from what I know of your natural theology, as a nice Swinburnian, you make an inductive argument for the existence of God as the fundamental reality, or at least one of your arguments is more inductive, inference to best explanation. So I agree, if you take an inductive route, you don't have to get into logical necessities. I get that. But nevertheless, if you do want to make an argument where, like a cosmological type argument, where you're trying to prove that there must be an independent, ungrounded reality to ground all dependent realities. If we argue along those lines, I certainly do that. I think people like Cameron and others do some version of that. But if you want to take that route, you cannot say that God's existence is just a brute fact, because a brute fact is a contingency that happens to exist without any explanation due to the nature of the thing or due to anything outside the thing. So do you, like, I mean, is that what you're saying, that God is a brutally contingent that just happens to exist? Because when you appeal to God's omnipotence, i.e. God is an omnipotence trope, it's part of the very nature of that an omnipotence trope exists, right? That's part of the very nature of the omnipotence trope, that like it must be actualized. This trope must be actual. If that's what you think of what God is, then you are actually saying that God is the necessary existence due to himself, and the himself that you appeal to would be something like the omnipotence trope. So I think you're having it both ways. I think you do believe God is necessary in a logical sense. Maybe you're not happy with how modern analytics have talked about divine necessity, and that's totally fair, because I'm not happy with how they do it. But to say overall that people are confused about what God's necessity means, and likewise God's existence being God's essence, again, we came up with this. It's the Islamic philosophers and mystics. We've come up with this, and we've had no problem defending this. And let's not project the failures of modern analytic philosophy, which many people are critical of, on the entire global history of philosophy.
Yeah. I think what I've seen sort of with our discussion and then discussion yesterday as well, is when you're operating in different frameworks, like metaphysical frameworks and the assumptions. So let's say analytic philosophy and Thomistic philosophy or scholastic philosophy, and then maybe Islamic philosophy in the medieval period and before that. And you just have different ways of defining terms and different ways of understanding things. So when I'm saying that God is not necessary, I'm saying it in the sense of an analytic philosopher, where we normally would say necessity is modal necessity. And that's to say, does God exist in every possible world? I don't feel you have to put forward that to be able to have the God that you want to take to be fundamental. I am open to maybe in your interpretation of what necessity is, and you were saying in your tradition as well. I would have to look into that and sort of understand the terms better before I sort of subscribe to it. But yeah, I mean, I'm open to that. But in the sense of what I was understanding necessity to be like, I would saying that you wouldn't say that to be the case. But also with the idea of a brute fact, and because I was saying that because God is eternal and he's omnipotent, then there couldn't be a time when he doesn't exist, and he'll always exist, and there's nothing that could take him out of existence. But you can still be a brute fact. And so you could think of, for example, let's say the universe, which was assumed to be eternal. And let's say you assume that the universe is eternal and it has no cause. Again, that a lot of people will say, well, it just has a brute fact. There's no further explanation for why it exists. It's just there. The universe exists. But it can never be the case that the universe doesn't exist, given its eternality. future and backwardly. And so it can never be the case that there isn't a universe there. So a brute fact can still be had in that you're just saying there is no metaphysical explanation in virtue of something deeper than that being, why that being exists. And so all I was saying is that the sort of explanatory chain for why God exists just stops with him, and there is nothing else more than that. And so for me, that's just the explanation. And then a further question would be, well, why is there a God? Well, someone could say, well, I don't know, but there will always be a God, given that he's eternal and he's omnipotent, so there'll never be a time when there isn't a God. But it's still brute in that sense. But again, what I'm trying to say to people is, again, it depends your frameworks. It depends on natural theology that you're doing as well, because someone who takes more of the scholastic route, maybe uses the 5 ways, will come to a different understanding of what fundamentality is for the pure actus, the pure actuality. If you take more, let's say, the William Lane Craig route with the deductive arguments, again, you'll come to a different understanding of necessity, maybe self-existence or existing in virtue of your nature. If you take the Swinburnian route or the abductive route, which I take, you sort of lead to fundamentality where there's no further metaphysical ground. So I think, there's just sort of, we might, if we come together and really think about these matters, we might agree on actually the terms that you're using. And I might say, actually, God does have that. But just with the terms, the way I was defining them, I would say no, just sort of within my framework.
So let's do this now. Like I said, we're nearing the 2 hour. Well, we're past the 2 hour mark at this point. So let's go ahead and move to some just closing thoughts. And what I'd like to do is have Khalil go first, share maybe 2 or 3 minutes your closing thoughts. Then we'll go to Steven, so that way you guys can both share your both of your perspectives. And then we'll give Josh maybe a little bit more time because it is still like a 2v1 dynamic. So we'll give Josh the last word here, but I wanted to give both of you a chance to share some of your closing thoughts. So let's now move to Khalil.
Sure. So again, I was very happy to participate in this, and the reason why I agreed to this is because Joshua, despite my disagreements with him at a philosophical and a theological level, Joshua is very easy to interact with. His work is very accessible. His ideas are very clearly stated. And having this sort of exchange with you, which I've done before, it's always fun. And it's always enriching. So I'm glad to be part of it. Despite the fact that I came here to argue against your Trinity model, in my humble opinion, as a non-Christian, I do think that your Trinity model, which is also espoused by my colleague Bo Branson, I think it's the best one on offer. So I appreciate that you take the time to talk about it with us and with other people. I guess just to restate, right, some of the objections that Stephen and I floated today were we're not convinced that Jesus, even as presented in the New Testament, actually claims divinity per se, or that he claims to be God. You did make a comment about Larry Hurtado and early Christian devotion, which we didn't fully get to respond to, but I would just say that there's a jump from devotion to ontology, and a human being the center of devotional practices does not entail that person is ontologically divine or ontologically God. In Shia Islam, the figure of the Imam and the figures of the prophets and the Prophet's family, they are at the center of Shia Muslim devotion, but we don't think that they're God. So I think this is a problem in the study of religion, where people who make these arguments like Hurtado and Bauckham and whomever, they have a tunnel vision when it comes to what divinity is. I think my thing paused a bit. Sorry.
Yeah, it
people
looks like
like
the internet is should be coming back now. It looks good.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that certain Christian authors like Bauckham, Hurtado, and others, they don't seem to be schooled in the wider study of religion, like Hinduism or Islam or whatever. So sometimes if you had a wider perspective, you could see that a personal devotion, even cultic devotion to an entity, does not entail that the entity ontologically is divine or ontologically is God. I was happy to discuss the Aseity objection with you as well as others, and I'm actually honored that you went back and rejigged what you said about Aseity, possibly due to my objections last year. So I think that's cool. I think you're an honorable person to sort of go and keep working on your models. And when I talk to you, I have to go back and work on my models. So otherwise, it's been really fun, and I look forward to more interactions with you, Joshua. And Cameron, thank you for being such a gracious host.
No problem. All right, let's move to Steven.
I also would like to say thank you very much, Cameron, for hosting us on your channel. Thank you very much, Joshua, for agreeing to talk. I really like talking to you. You're very sharp. You are straight to the point. You make your points clearly, and I can tell that you enjoy the back and forth. I don't think anybody gets into this line of work unless they like the dialectic and the debate, and so I like it too. This seems to me to have been a debate that kind of moved in slow motion. It was more of a chess match than a boxing match, because, just as the way these things turned out, all of us sort of spoke much longer. We didn't get sort of rapid fire back and forth. And so that means that a lot of things were left unsaid out of the interest of time. I'm sure Josh has a lot of things that he wish he could have said. I'm sure Khalil the same way. I know for myself, I feel like there are a lot of things that I still would want to say about everything that we've talked about thus far, but we don't have the opportunity. So, this has been a debate in slow motion. I think we've made some progress, and we've clarified our positions to one another, and we've understood sort of how we are positioning ourselves on the logical battlefield, so to speak. But I don't think that any of these issues have been resolved to any of our satisfaction. And I don't mean only me and Khalil versus you, Joshua, but I'm sure also you feel too that perhaps some of your arguments were not yet decisively landed against us. So this is a conversation that absolutely should continue going on into the future. Obviously, we all really enjoy talking to each other. It's a lot of fun. I will just say this much. A lot of times I'll find that an argument is very convincing to me because I have a certain system in mind, and the problems or the ways out of that argument don't immediately occur to me because of all the stuff that's going on in the background. But when you present that same argument to somebody who has a different system in their mind, and they find an escape route that you find totally implausible, but for them it works because they don't have the same background, framework. It's an interesting thing to see happen. You think an argument is decisive, and then somebody else gets around it, with something that you think is tricky or maybe not so convincing. That's how all these things go. There's the proverb, I think it's in chapter 18. One person comes and he makes his case and it sounds good until someone else comes and cross-examines him, and then maybe it's not so clear anymore. That's how it always feels like me with these discussions. I'm really convinced of an idea, and then somebody else gives me some quick responses. Then I'm like, hold on, no, something isn't right here. And then I hear somebody else make a case, and then I hear him get questioned, and then I'm not so sure what to believe anymore. So that's how these things go. But I very much enjoyed the conversation. I think it would be worth, continuing the discussion, whether here or by other means. And again, I'd like to thank Cameron and Joshua for talking, Khalil also, and I look forward to what future discussions will bring.
All right, let's move to Josh.
Yeah, so again, thank you so much, Cameron, for hosting us. It was a really good discussion, really good dialogue, and I think we got into a great amount of depth with some of the issues. Obviously, we're just scratching the surface because there's so much more that we can go into, but I'm really grateful for the platform that you've given us to speak. And also, Khalil and Stephen, thank you so much for your gracefulness. I really enjoy the way that you interacting with the arguments, because a lot of people, they just have their own viewpoints and they're not really actually trying to analyze what the person is saying. And it does help. I mean, at the end of the day, we're all we're trying to be directed towards the truth. We're trying to find whatever the truth is. And through these dialogues, in some small manner, we are sort of helping ourselves each by our objections, by the propositions we put forward, by them being blown down or potentially withstanding the objection. We are closer to the truth in some way. So I'm very grateful for, again, just the way that you guys handled the conversation and for your great thoughts, because a lot of them are issues that I, again, will have to go back and rethink and say, actually, maybe there is a problem here. Maybe I need to rejig this issue. So, this has been very fruitful. I'm very grateful for that. But in general, just to sort of restate what the position I was trying to put forward, my sort of flag is pitched in the tent of monarchical Trinitarianism, which I believe is the sort of expression of the revealed scriptures that we have, and then also the conciliar texts that we have, the belief in one God who's the Father, and we have two other divine persons who are homoousios with the Father. They share the same nature as him. And I believe, as I was saying, it sort of fits with the biblical text and expresses what the creeds were saying. And so it's a historically grounded and biblically loyal as such model, and it's one that also escapes certain philosophical problems such as the logical problem of the Trinity. But again, there are issues that need to be dealt with. The Aseity problem hasn't been fully dealt with, and there are ways to sort of go back to the drawing board and to think through them. But yeah, I'm just very grateful for this. And just one more thing you were saying, just with the Hurtado stuff. What I would just say, because bless the situation, Hurtado is not around anymore, so unfortunately there won't be people. He won't be defending his work. But if I was thinking as him, he would probably say, within the context of ancient Jewish monotheism, so the specific form of monotheism that he's looking at is within a certain period of time, and within that certain period of time, worship was the indicator of who is the God that we are to follow over the other pagan deities. And so if worship was sort of in that devotional pattern was ascribed to the Son or to Jesus, then there is something going on here which is different from the elevation of other patriarchs in the future. But again, there's more that can be pushed back on that. And again, I would love to have another discussion with you, another dialogue, or maybe we can take this to the journals or something and have a back and forth, a written exchange, which would be good as well. But yeah, thank you very much, guys, for this. Again, you've been lovely, and it's been really good having this conversation.
All right. So once again, thanks to Khalil. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Steven, for coming on to discuss this. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?